The text for this message comes from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through to 34. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." May God add his blessing to the reading and to the understanding of his word. How would you describe your walk with God? Would you call it stagnant, vibrant, changing, relevant to the challenges you're facing in life? If your walk could be better, if your walk could be more meaningful, more vibrant, would you take the steps required to make that happen? It's easier than you think. In this message, I want to share the story of a woman whose crisis led to a transformation in her life. She took 3 steps in response to this crisis, 3 steps that anyone can take. Anyone can take. We don't know this woman's name, but she had a serious and life-threatening health issue. The King James Version refers to her as the woman with an issue of blood. I don't know what picture comes to mind when you hear this story or think about this woman. I've always pictured her as old. But the Bible doesn't say that she was old. The only indication of her age is that she is called a woman and not a child. What we do know is that she wrestled with this issue for 12 years. And this problem cost her everything. It cost her physically. Imagine if you had an issue with your blood for 12 years. It would have left her exhausted. It took its toll on her financially. Verse 26 said that she spent all that she had trying to get medical help and didn't succeed. It also took a toll on her relationally. Now, we don't know about her family, but when I thought about this woman and realized that the average lifespan in the day of Jesus was about 40 years, if this woman had this issue of blood for 12 years, these would have been her childbearing years. So I wondered, did she have children? Was she alone? Was she married? And that day a husband could divorce a woman for most anything. Would a husband put up with this condition? She may have been all alone. She definitely was isolated from her community. For according to Leviticus chapter 15, anybody who was bleeding was considered unclean. And if you were unclean, you were not to go near other people. For everything you touched was unclean and had to be washed. If you touched an individual, they were unclean for the rest of the day until evening. They would have to wash their clothes and take a bath. This woman also would have felt isolated from God. She was not welcome in worship. You can imagine what it would be like if for 12 years you could not attend worship, or if you could not be physically close to people who shared your faith. She must have felt that God was far away. It is amazing that this woman was even in the crowd that day, but it speaks of her desperation, for no doctor could help her. She had no more money, and she was running out of hope. Desperate people do desperate things. And we see in her desperation that she took action. Now, there may be someone listening to this who feels that they are at the end of their rope. Perhaps you have exhausted all your resources. I hope you'll be encouraged by the story and the example of this woman. The first choice that she made that led to a transformation in her life was she chose to move closer to Jesus. When a trial comes our way, we tend to respond in one of two ways. We can let the trial come between us and God, or allow it to push us closer to God. She chose the latter, and her life was never the same. But moving closer to Jesus was not enough to change her. Some people think if they go to church, that will change their life. Going to church won't necessarily change your life. It hopefully will put you in a position where your life might be changed. But walking into a church building isn't guaranteed to change your life. For this woman, being closer to Jesus in the crowd that day did not change her life. She had to take a second step, and that was that she chose to reach out to Jesus. Many of us know we should reach out to Jesus in times of crisis, but we often prefer worry. We often prefer to be frantic. I find this a challenge sometimes. Even though I'm generally a calm person, there have been times in my life when I've just been so distressed, so upset that I couldn't pray. I preferred to pace or to talk to somebody when prayer was what I needed to do. Tony Evans, a popular black preacher from Texas, tells the story of being stuck in an elevator one day. He was in an elevator that was in a high-rise building, and as the elevator went up to the higher floors, it stopped between floors. Perhaps you've had that experience. It can be quite nerve-wracking. He says it was interesting to watch people's reaction. Some people became frantic immediately and began pounding on the door of the elevator. Others started screaming and yelling, hoping people on the nearby floors would hear them and come to the rescue. After watching people's reaction, Tony Evans just walked to the wall by the door, opened that little door with a small handle, and pulled out the telephone, and he called for help. He said, I could have whispered, and the person on the other end would have heard me. He said, in this world, we're going to be stuck in places we don't want to be. So what will our reaction be? Our first reaction can be to reach out to Jesus. Well, that's what this woman did. It says in verse 27, she came up behind Jesus in the crowd and touched his cloak. I don't think she walked up to Jesus and just reached out her finger to barely touch his garment. The word here in verse 27 for touch means to cling to hold on to. I think she probably reached out for his garment and held on for dear life, for Jesus was her only hope. I wonder why she did that. She didn't attend a Sunday school class that said if you want to be healed by Jesus, touch his garments. She never heard a preacher say there's power in his clothes. No, she must have seen Jesus healing people, or at least heard of him. And it says that she believed. In verse 27, she thought to herself, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. She believed and she reached out. Verse 29 tells us immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Don't you love the stories of Jesus? He changes every life that comes in contact with him. And this is a wonderful story, but it doesn't end here. It could have ended here. She chose to move closer to Jesus, She chose to reach out to him and she was healed. But this story is not just about this woman and her healing. This story is actually a story within a story. If you remember at the beginning of the scripture reading, the story did not start with her need, but with Jairus coming to Jesus. Jairus himself had a need. For when Jairus came to Jesus, he had a daughter who was dying. This is not just about the woman's healing. There's a bigger story here. Now picture the scene. Verse 21 and verse 24 tell us that a large crowd had gathered. Don't picture a celebrity or dignitary walking down a red carpet with the crowd at arm's length. No, there wouldn't have been much room in this crowd. Jesus is walking. He feels the power leave him. And verse 30 says he turned around and asked, "Who touched me?" That seemed like a silly question to ask from the viewpoint of the disciples. And we know that Jesus must have known who touched her. But he asked, and he stopped, and he waited. He really put this woman on the spot. As I picture what was happening here, it's like Jesus put her on a platform and stuck a microphone in her face. She had an audience. He asked her a question, and she knew the answer, and everyone waited. Verse 33 tells us the woman's response. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. I wonder what she said. I suspect she might have gone back 12 years and said, "Jesus, let me tell you about the day that changed my life. When I found out I had an incurable disease." I think she must have told him about 12 years of frustration and fear, and of her financial ruin, of the isolation, and how she was losing hope. I think of Psalm 70, verse 4, that says, "May all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, 'The Lord is great.'" That was her testimony. For Jesus alone changed her life. I wonder, though, why was that necessary for her to be put on the spot? Jesus forced her almost to speak up. So not only did she choose to move closer to Jesus, she chose to reach out to Jesus, she also chose to speak up for Jesus. I think this is an important question to ask, because sometimes Jesus healed people privately. Sometimes he healed people and said, "Don't tell anyone." But Jesus here wanted the woman to speak up. There was someone else in that crowd that day. Now we know that it was a large crowd, but we know the name of one person who was in the crowd. It was Jairus. Jairus went to Jesus and pleaded with Jesus to come with him and heal his dying daughter. And Jesus was on his way to the home of Jairus when he met this woman with the issue of blood. If I were Jairus, I would have felt probably angry and resentful that this woman had interrupted Jesus when his situation was desperate. Jairus had the faith that Jesus would heal his daughter. But then he received the news that every parent dreads. In verse 35, some men came to Jairus and told him that his daughter had died. They told him not to bother the teacher anymore. Jairus must have been devastated, but only for a moment. For you see, he had just witnessed a miracle. He had just witnessed a miracle. He had just heard the testimony of this woman. And it says that as Jesus was speaking, these men came and brought him the news. And then in verse 36, Ignoring what they said, Jesus told Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Well, he could, because of what he had just heard. And Jesus went to the home of Jairus, and his daughter was brought back to life. This woman with the issue of blood spoke up for Jesus so that Jairus could have the faith to believe. A missionary from India told of his experience as a medical missionary. He worked in an area where there was progressive blindness, where the people were born with good sight, but something in the environment affected their vision, and many lost their sight. Well, as a doctor, he was able to come up with a procedure to prevent this blindness. And so people would come to him asking for help, and because of his help, they not only regained their sight, but they had hope for the future. These people never said thank you to the missionary. The words thank you weren't in their vocabulary. But they had a different word that means, I will tell your name. And so they didn't thank him, but they said, I will tell your name. And everywhere they went, they told the name of the missionary who had changed their lives. I believe that if we want a more vibrant Christian faith, we can do so by moving closer to Jesus, by reaching out to Jesus, and by speaking up for Jesus. For we never know what Jairus in our company might need to hear of the power and the hope that is in Christ Jesus.